One of the most interesting parts about Guild Wars 3 thus far is how it is not a sequel to Guild Wars 2, but a prequel to both of the Guild Wars games, meaning that we are going back in time over 1,000 years in the timeline before the player character first steps foot into the pre-Syrian version of Ascalon. So today, let's run through the timeline on the most basic level and also speculate about some of the most interesting things we could see happening. The entire Guild Wars timeline is definitely very interesting and in-depth. Through each campaign and expansion in each game, we have not only gotten new information about the timeline just from the fact that we are experiencing present events, but we often get more information about historical events as well. For a quick run through of the biggest of the big things, we don't exactly know when the world of Tyria was specifically created by Suwan, but we can assume that it was a really long time ago. The earliest specific date that we can go back to is 20,000 before Exodus. Before Exodus being before the Exodus of the gods, which we'll get to in a moment. In 20,000 before Exodus, we can assume that a dragon rise happened this year as the dragons arose during the dragon cycle every 10,000-ish years. 10,000 years later, we have the most recent dragon rise that we know quite a bit about. This included all of the ancient races, being the Seers, Forgotten, Dwarves, Jotun, and Mersat, who fought and failed against the Elder Dragons with a wide variety of events. The next big date is in 786 before Exodus, where the human gods appeared in Tyria from another planet for the first time and brought with them humans. Yes, a little fun fact that some newer players are always surprised to hear is that humans are not native to Tyria, though they have been here for quite a while. Centuries later, the most important date is in 1 before Exodus, where the god Abaddon gave a ton of unbridled magic to the races of Tyria, which caused a lot of wars. The other gods, at the pleading of the human king Doric, fought against Abaddon and defeated him, imprisoning him within the realm of torment. As a result of this war, a large body of water known as the Crystal Sea turned into the Crystal Desert, alongside the desolation scarring parts of the northernmost reaches of Valona. As a result of this destruction, the human gods recognized that their potential conflicts would only ever continue to bring destruction to Tyria and decided to leave. Thus, the Exodus of the gods occurred, and all events hereafter are referred to as After Exodus. 1,070 years later, in 1070 after Exodus, the events of Guild Wars prophecies began that led to each eventual campaign, expansion, and content update for that game. And then a long time later, in 1325 after Exodus, the events of the Guild Wars 2 story begins that leads into each of its expansions and content updates, all the way to the current events of Visions of Eternity in the current year of 1339 after Exodus. Of course, these are just the biggest of the big things in the timeline, and we have learned Guild Wars 3 is set between two events. The latest event in the timeline for the upper end of Guild Wars 3 is the Exodus of the Gods, where we know that the story of Guild Wars 3 will be taking place before that happens in 0 after Exodus. As for the earliest of the events, well, it's a decently big one that happens in the year 48 before Exodus. Prior to this year, the human goddess Duena had a child with a mortal sculptor. No, not Malcor, it's just a coincidence. And this child was named Grinth. As Grinth's father was immortal, he was only a half-god until the year 48 after Exodus, where he, alongside 7 other mortals who would later become known as the Seven Reapers, challenged the god of death, Doom, for control over the dominion of the underworld. Doom consumed the souls of the dead, preventing resurrection and undeath, whereas Grinth wanted the souls of the dead to pass on to their designated afterlives. Through this battle, Doom eventually lost and became imprisoned to show up as a major boss in Guild Wars and Guild Wars 2, as Grinth ascended to godhood and elevated the Seven Reapers into his own avatars who would supervise the underworld. And alongside that, a young lady who was exiled by her people decided to devote herself to Grinth to seek revenge against all those who scorned her. Desmina became the first follower of the new god of death. Also in this year, Balthazar killed a bunch of people and helped a human army achieve victory, and some person named Ewan, who was the leader of an atheist group of humans, was cursed by Melandru to become plant-like creatures. More speculation on some of this in a future video. So, we know that Guild Wars 3 happens after 48 before Exodus, and before 0 after Exodus. This is a general 48-year period, and it could realistically happen anywhere. A lot of people would definitely be interested in experiencing the Exodus of the Gods at some point, and interestingly enough, the setting of Guild Wars 3 becomes an independent nation 2 years after the Exodus, which could maybe be a big deal. The only other event we know a bit about is that Lissa tested the villagers of the town of Rin and gave one, Sarah, her gift in 45 before Exodus, and we don't really know much more than that. Of course, while there are some big events here, we don't really know much more. If ArenaNet just wants to use this setting to create completely new stories that we don't really know much about, setting it closer to 48 before Exodus is a good idea for that, since it would take a long time to get to 0 before Exodus, assuming the story is like Guild Wars 2, where every real-world year is a year in game. But if ArenaNet wants to highlight the Exodus of the Gods as a story, setting it closer to 0 before Exodus is a good idea to be able to execute that. Of course, how close you initially set it depends on what year you want to highlight that story specifically. Say the game is set 5 years before the Exodus, and say the game fully releases in 2029, that means we will be playing the expansion related to the Exodus of the Gods in 2034 if we get annual expansions. We'd have 5 years of learning a lot about the world, and the gods before diving into the bigger story. So ultimately, between the dates of 48 before Exodus and 0 before Exodus, we don't know too many specific details, which will allow ArenaNet to create a ton of stories based on whatever they want, but we can assume from the events surrounding this, as well as the general state of the world during this time, a bunch of potential story beats that could be happening during this time, so let's go through them one by one. First of all, and one of the two most obvious ones, is Grinth becoming a new god. As we will likely have a lot of stories related to the gods, we will likely be having a ton of stuff going on with Grinth. The balance of power shifting in the world is interesting, alongside the ability for people to resurrect and others to move on to an afterlife is a pretty big deal. Many people will follow in Desmina's footsteps as the Church of Grinth will be established and expanding. Additionally, there is a good chance that Doom had many faithful followers, and that some of those followers will be having a crisis of faith, or will straight up disavow Grinth, which can lead to some major conflicts. Second, and the other of the two most obvious ones, is just drama related to Abaddon. ArenaNet loves Abaddon, and so do I, so it makes a lot of sense that a big focus on the story will be related to Abaddon. Abaddon is known as the Keeper of Secrets, and does have a history of keeping things from the human gods, which may cause some conflicts for us to deal with. Regardless of when the game starts, but especially if it is close to the Exodus, we can expect just a lot of issues with Abaddon working against the other gods, and the other gods becoming fed up with it that eventually did build up and lead to their battle against each other. Third, related to Abaddon, we can expect a lot of stories related to the Morganites. In 175 before Exodus, Morganite settlements appeared along the coastlines north and west of Alona and around the Crystal Sea, and Morganite civilization became a seafaring one. Of course, the Morganites chose to only worship Abaddon, which means that in any conflict with Abaddon, we will be interacting with Morganites. Additionally, having storylines related to the Crystal Sea is probably something that everyone wants, just because it is so incredibly unique to this game, as it doesn't exist in Guild Wars or Guild Wars 2. Fourth is Keen Doric. This is actually a really interesting character that I have really wanted to dive further into in a video, and hopefully will in the future. But Keen Doric was the one who united the human tribes of the Tyrian continent and became the King of the Republic of Ascalon in 100 before Exodus, and he lived a very long life as he played a pivotal role in Tyrian history right before the Exodus of the Gods. So as we are playing through which is a human territory, we will likely be interacting with the human king. Fifth is Ascalon. In 100 before Exodus, humans settled in Ascalon and pushed the Char out. While the game is not set in Ascalon, we may still be interacting with it to some degree, like with people from there or a trade to and from there. Additionally, this is the perfect setting for a future expansion for Guild Wars 3 down the road that could be a very sensible thing to have happen. Additionally, this brings up the Char as an interesting factor. Lots of people want to play as a Char, but I don't think that makes all that much sense at this current point in the story. Additionally, it could be a sensible thing that happens, but it's even a stretch to say that we will be interacting with them at all outside of potential nomads, as the Char are pushed super far north and didn't really return until they started reclaiming Ascalon in the original Guild Wars. I'll also quickly mention here that Kryta is a thing that I believe exists during this time, but it's not really anywhere near as big of a thing as we see it later on. Sixth is Alona. Alona is a very interesting location because it has such a deep history, and we know quite a bit about Alonian history. During the time frame that Guild Wars 3 is set in, we don't know all that much about Alona, but we do know that it was at one of its greatest heights. Just like Ascalon, we can presumably be interacting with Alona quite a bit, and this could very well be a setting one day. and to quickly go over it, Paulo Ojoko likely won't be playing a part in Guild Wars 3, given the fact that he was presumably born in the 8th century after Exodus, which is corroborated by the fact that he grew up at the same time as Mad King Thorn, who was also a child during this time. 7th is Cantha. Now this is one of the biggest ones just because of the connections that the human gods have to Cantha, as they first appeared here before humanity spread out across the planet. Similar to Alona, Cantha has such a deep history with a lot going on, but there's something very interesting going on. You see, because there's so much of it, Canthan history is split up into different ages. During the events of Guild Wars 3, it is the Age of the Falcon. During this time, Cantha apparently was a bit of an isolated country and didn't interact much with the rest of the world, including the Kingdom of Tyria. So potentially, we won't be interacting much with Cantha, or really going here at all, but of course it's still potentially on the table. I will mention that in 100 before Exodus, when King Dark became ruler, he did receive an ambassador from Cantha, which means they aren't completely cut off like how they were between the events of Guild Wars Winds of Change and Guild Wars 2 End of Dragons. 8th is the Dwarves. Dwarves are one of the most ancient races of Tyria, and we don't know too many specifics about their ancient history, but in Guild Wars we can see the Stone Summit and Dildramore as the two big dwarven nations, and we can assume that the Dildramore came to be starting in 675 before Exodus. So during the events of Guild Wars 3, the Dwarves are likely a pretty large nation with a lot going on. Additionally, assuming that the lands they are living in is the same as in the original Guild Wars, they are actually very, very close to ore, which means we have to be interacting with them, and thus they are written out for some reason. A lot of people are also hoping that dwarves will become one of the playable races in Guild Wars 3, which I feel like is a decently likely thing to have happen. 9th is related to the other ancient races, those being the Jotun, Seers, Mersat, and Forgotten. The Seers and Mersat are a decently big opportunity, especially since we know ArenaNet loves to use the Mersat at any available opportunity. There aren't too many Seers alive at this point in Tyrian history, but they have been found around this area of the world. There are a ton of Mersat alive at this point, but they are pretty distant, so it could be a coin toss for either of those. The Jotun could play a big part because according to Jotun legend, the human gods gave them magic which empowered them, but we don't have much information about that beyond oral tradition. But we do know that some Jotun artifacts can be found in ore. The Forgotten, in my opinion, are very likely to play a part. The Forgotten did exist during this time and did exist in this area of the world. Additionally, the Forgotten were devout followers of the human gods, and in a game focusing a lot on the human gods, it makes a lot of sense to see them. 10th, kind of related to the ancient races, is the Wizard's Court and Astral Ward. This is a newer group of people we have met mechanically in Guild Wars 2, but lore-wise have existed for a very long time now. Now, I feel like it is extremely unlikely that we will ever interact with them to the same degree as we do in Guild Wars 2, just from a story point of view, but I will say that it is decently likely that we may interact with them to some degree. A lot of people would probably enjoy interacting with Mabon in some way, just because his life in Guild Wars 2 was cut short, and many people wanted more time with him, which could be satisfied by interacting with him in Guild Wars 3. But again, I don't think this will ever happen to an extreme degree, even if at all. 11th is Glint. Glint, originally known as Gloust, was cleansed of the corruption of Krakatorrik by the Forgotten. Now Glint was cleansed within Ra, which is likely the capital of Guild Wars 3, and the Forgotten are likely going to play a part in Guild Wars 3, so everything just lines up to make Glint a character who will appear in Guild Wars 3. An interesting tidbit to think about is how Glint's lair was in the Crystal Desert, which did not exist at some point. Of course, Glint compiled the Flameseeker prophecies in 272 after Exodus, long after the potential events of Guild Wars 3. 12th is Zaitan. I think this is something everyone has been thinking of since Guild Wars 3 was announced. During the events of Guild Wars 3, Zaitan is slumbering underneath ore, giving off a bunch of magic. Now Zaitan doesn't necessarily directly play a role in the events of the world during this time, other than the potential magical impact that he has, but it would be a very sensible and potentially super cool thing to see Zaitan at some point during Guild Wars 3. 13th are the Kodan. A lot of people are probably a bit confused by the thought of Kodan being an ore, but it's actually already an established fact. Established in a Guild Wars 2 expansion, Janthir Wilds, which released after the production of Guild Wars 3 started. We should have seen that coming, but you can find a journal from Isgarn that describes how Waiting Sorrow's tribe that fled from the far north sometime in the years between 10,000 and 1,000 before Exodus split between Janthir and Or, the ones in Janthir being the Lowland Kodan we met in the expansion, but the ones in Or we don't know all that much about, but we may soon enough. 14th are the Asuran. Similar to the Coden, the Asuran may be a little confusing for some people, but actually makes a lot of sense. Ancient Asuran cities have been found throughout central Tyria since the start of Guild Wars 2 and even in Guild Wars, the most notable of which may be being Radab 10 in the Steamspur Mountains, near where the dwarves could potentially be located in Guild Wars 3, but there's also quite a few throughout the Tarnished Coast as well. These have been a long point of speculation, but the easiest answer that seems to be coming to fruition is that the Asuran used to live on the surface during the events of Guild Wars 3 before going underground and losing their hair due to the lack of vitamin D from the sun for over 1,000 years. And those are all the biggest things that I think could be going on during this time. Of course, there's a lot of little stuff alongside a lot of stuff that we obviously don't know about, and we'll learn during the events of Guild Wars 3. This includes stuff like the dredge, but we don't have too many concrete facts that we can directly mention like we did with everything else in this video. An important thing to remember is that this game is set nearly 1400 years before modern day Guild Wars 2, and if Tyria is anything like our real world, our knowledge of 1400 years ago can be incredibly hazy. As empires rise and fall, the world shifts, and knowledge can be forgotten or misremembered. So truly, a lot could happen. And that's the video. I hope you enjoyed. There is definitely a lot of stuff you can dive into when it comes to speculating about Guild Wars 3's story, and this was just a broad overview of the biggest things. Do not worry, we have a lot more to talk about. I want to make longer videos about every single thing we talked about. I hope you all enjoyed watching, and I hope you all are taking great care of yourselves. Have a good one, everyone.